Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Monday. You are tuned in to another episode of Go Beyond. And just as a reminder, Go Beyond is a time that Reverend Daniel Humbert and myself come together to dig deeper into the message that we heard together on Sunday. My name is Alyssa Robinson. I am the digital strategist here at Treach. And this past week, we were wrapping up our worship series called Rechurch, where we were reading through the book of Acts together. So last week we were focused on Acts chapters 7 and 8. This week we jumped way ahead to Acts chapter 15. So I hope that if you haven't yet had the opportunity, you'll read 8 through 15 because there's some really fun stuff in there, including Saul being struck blind and then not becoming Paul, but beginning to go by Paul, and starting his ministry and becoming a part of the church. And so that's where I really want to start today, because we picked up on Sunday in Acts chapter 15, where Paul and Barnabas are working together to build a community for church and kind of better understand what is this going to be? What rules are we going to follow? What rules are we not going to follow? But I want to start by asking Daniel to help us better understand the relationship between Paul and Barnabas, because Paul was like a grade A Christian killer, and he was out like slaying day after day after day. And I don't understand, how did he become the leader of the church? How were people willing to trust him? Because I'll say, me being an 8 on the Enneagram, I'd be like, no,
Yeah.
I remember you.
Yeah. Well, so just real quick. So we first hear about Barnabas in chapter 4 of Acts. That's kind of where he's introduced. And then we next see Barnabas when he is helping Saul in his conversion in chapter 9. So strangely enough, in Acts chapter 9, when Saul has his conversion to Christianity, Barnabas is sort of first on deck to help him out post Ananias, who, Paul spent a little bit of time with at his house. But Barnabas is there to kind of pick up Saul and act as his, I'll just call him sort of emissary, to kind of give him the in to the church. And so it's their relationship that kind of buys Paul or Saul, who will become Paul, the opportunity for people to begin to trust him. And then over the next several chapters, chapter 12, chapter 13, we begin to see that Paul and Barnabas are having these amazing journeys where they're, talking about the faith, healing people, teaching people. And that's where Paul begins to get the trust built up. So it starts with this great friendship with Barnabas. And then as they begin to go out sort of 2 by 2, if you will, people begin to trust them. They knew Barnabas. And now with him by Paul's side, they begin to do what they do. And of course, Paul is very persuasive in his arguments. And he would literally use that word, what I call the ancient tradition of argument. That is to say, I'm giving you my setup about why you should believe the way you believe and what that looks like. And so Paul is very persuasive, and that's how he begins to become the great emissary for Christianity, writing his letters to the churches, setting up the churches, and traveling so far in the known world. That's how people start to trust him. And he just becomes highly trustworthy. And he becomes this powerful figure for the faith. And chapter 15 in part gives us a bit of that description.
Well, and it when we begin with chapter 15, one of the big things that we talked about on Sunday was removing the barrier to connect with God. And one of the big debating points that the Pharisees brought up was, we have all of these Gentiles joining the movement, and they need to be circumcised if they want to practice this faith alongside with us. It's the way we've always done it. This is tradition. This is what has to be done. And so this seems to be like a huge deal. Paul and Barnabas go away and have a serious debate about it. They bring in other people and be like, oh, this circumcision thing. So walk me through the history of circumcision. This is a fun topic, everybody. I bet you didn't expect to hear us talking about circumcision today. So walk me through the history of it. Why was this such a big deal? where did it come from and why did it start? Because I understand that circumcision is a deeply rooted Jewish tradition, but I don't really get where this even came from.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so two things. One is circumcision is to Hebrews what baptism is to Christians. And what I mean by that is it is the rite of initiation into the tradition of the faith. And so just like for Christians, we get baptized, and that's kind of the rite of initiation into the faith. That's what circumcision was. It was the rite of initiation. It goes all the way back to Abraham. Abraham, there's kind of an initial covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, where Abraham is called and he's going to be the father of many nations, and God makes this great covenant with him. And then in Genesis chapter 17, that's when God initiates the covenant of circumcision. Now, Abraham is an old man. He's in his 90s and he gets circumcised. But the covenant of the circumcision is set up in Genesis chapter 17 for newborn babies on the 8th day. It's called a bris. And so for Jewish males, by the 8th, no later than the 8th day, and the 8th day is considered the day to do it, the infant would be circumcised. And it was a way to say it's clear that these kids are set aside. It's clear that they're going to be different because that custom was not a part of the rest of the Middle Eastern cultures or any other religions. There were a few, what I would call sort of fringe states that sort of had circumcision as a component, but not many. And so for the Hebrews, this was a huge sign and a symbol that, man, I'm all in, as you can well imagine. That just, you can't go halfways on this. You have to go all in. And so that's what it was. And from that point on, circumcision becomes the delineator between Hebrews and non-Hebrews. Now, I won't go into a lot of this.
Is it like pull down your pants and show me your faith?
Yeah.
Is that the idea?
Well, that's the part I wasn't going to go in, but thanks for bringing that up. Is how does this happen? Well, part of it happens in public baths. That was a normal kind of deal, that there would be public baths and people could tell whether you were circumcised or not. And so that became very clear that this must be a Hebrew because they are marked. And so again, I liken it to the Christian understanding of baptism. It is a marking, it is an initiation, and it's public. A bris is public only to the degree that it's family and the rabbi, because back in the day it was a rabbi who did it. I think in Orthodox traditions it still may be the rabbi, but in most other Jewish traditions it's done, of course, by a physician now. But it's very much a religious ceremony, and it's a clear form of marking, and it became so clear and so much a part of the Hebrew tradition that's why it became such a arguing point here in Acts chapter 15. As you may recall, there were at least two very clear conversations that these new converts from Gentiles to Christians must be circumcised, otherwise they can't be considered a follower of Jesus. Now, I am grateful that we don't have that same form of evangelism now. I mean, I can't even fathom what kind of evangelism that must have been to say, hey, you get circumcised in order to be a follower of Jesus. And I don't doubt that was a stumbling block for some, right?
Well, and so once they finally get to that decision in Acts chapter 15, verse 19, they kind of come to the decision and tell the Pharisees, we're not going to make Gentiles get circumcised. But then they list out rules that you do need to continue to follow. So how do they decide which rules should and should not be followed?
Yeah, well, I don't know that I have a great answer for you, but I have some and I don't think it's a great answer simply because it's hard to get in their heads, right? I mean, that's 2,000 years ago. And so why they came up with these four, you may recall there's four stipulations, three of which center around food or animals, and one of which, stems around sex, sexual relationship. And so one concept stands that, golly, so here are these Gentiles, they're converted, and we've got all these longstanding Hebrews who've converted. And so we're going to need to find some form of middle ground that says, hey, we all need to have something in common. And certainly some of that might center around food sacrificed to idols, the way in which you slaughter an animal, blood, and then, of course, fornication. Well, fornication is relatively straightforward. Golly, with fertility religions all around them, it was clear that we all needed to abstain from those fertility religions. And that's what the fornication was primarily referencing, sex outside of marriage, and certainly from the fertility gods. But with regard to the animal stuff, this is where it's important to know the Old Testament and how impactful the Old Testament is on the New Testament. In Leviticus, which is, golly, every one of our favorite book to read, right? In Leviticus chapter 17 and 18, this is where they actually find that these stipulations about the way in which we slaughter an animal, the animals sacrificed to idols, as was some of the tradition, and animals with still having blood in them, those rules that were established in Leviticus were actually established both for Hebrews and for aliens in our midst. And so it seems like James and John and Peter and Paul and Barnabas felt that that was important enough to say, well, golly, if that was established not only for Hebrews back then, but for foreigners and aliens, surely that must be the way we're going to render it for Gentiles, that Gentiles still need to keep these rules because they were established so long ago, even for non-believers. So my hunch is and the rabbis would sort of teach that. The rabbis would say, golly, this was good for foreigners, so it must be good for these new Gentile converts. So my hunch is that's how that all got started.
Well, and at what point, if you know, because I didn't prepare you for this question, at what point in the Christian faith and the journey of the church did we abandon those rules as well, of like, we're not going to have those same dietary restrictions?
Yeah, well, that actually seems to stem from Paul. I mean, the reality is no fornication would remain intact, right? But the dietary stuff about how one slaughters an animal and whether or not it's slaughtered in front of an idol, Paul actually speaks to that in Romans and in Corinthians to his letters. And he basically says, we kind of get that is not really important anymore. And we recognize that if we don't believe in those idols and we don't believe in that format of worship, then it doesn't really matter if that animal was slaughtered in that fashion, because when all is said and done, we don't believe that. We don't believe that it makes any difference. And we don't believe that that has any impact on who we are. So if you're asking for specific date, I don't have that. But it seems to be Paul begins to set that up as, golly, that's really not as important as we may have thought. And therefore, if you're with somebody and you're having dinner at their house and they have an animal, they have a meal that's been slaughtered to an idol, don't make a big deal of it. Just eat it and don't, lift it up or highlight it or say, oh my gosh, I can't eat that because Paul is much more about the love and the grace as he gets older, if you will, than when they were making these initial decisions.
So my last question, we talk a lot about especially this year, about staying focused. And one of the things that we so value about the original church and watching them come together to build a community around faith is that they were so focused. But historically, how were they able to do this? How were they able to stay on message? Because we have issues now. And we have so many communication resources available to us. We can send things out through text messages, through social media, through our website, through advertisements, through signage, everything to make sure that we're staying on message and everybody's getting the information. But back then, everything was word of mouth. And it just seems like it would be, if they have thousands of followers, it would just be a game of telephone. Were there groups breaking off, doing their own thing because they didn't understand what was happening? Like, how did they keep that all together?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I wish that I had a simple answer. So I'm going to give you as straightforward an answer as I can. And it may not feel very hopeful, but I believe it's hopeful. They weren't as unanimous and unified as you may imagine. In part, there are two things here. One is, all of that source of communication you just identified, I think is all needful and is all helpful, but I think also can contribute to a dichotomy of message, right? I think there's way too many opportunities for that to go in different directions. And so in modern day times, I think we shoot ourselves in the foot. I think often we get far too many forms of communication, and therefore it kind of it diverges. But a part of why it feels that they're so unanimous in modern day times is we have the canon, the basic set of scriptures, but there were other letters, there were other gospels, there were other churches, there were people going rogue, and there were people sort of diverging from these purposes. It's why there began to be, by the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century in the church, all of these councils that would say, hey, we're not doing that anymore, and you can't believe that, and you got to stick to this message. Because in those first 2 to 4 centuries, there were all of these divergent tangents. And so I think the miracle in all of that is the church did remain focused and the church did remain on target. But there were plenty of folks going all kinds of ways, and we just don't hear about it because the canon is focused. The text that we have, the scriptures that we have are focused. But man, there were all kinds of other writings out there that claimed authority that didn't make it into the canon, and they were off the wall. Some of them, I mean, some of them are really weird. That's why they didn't make the canon. But the church did get off target from time to time, individual communities of faith. But the larger church stayed intact because of the councils that transpired over the decades and centuries.
I feel like that's a study I would be very interested in. We can call it the cutting room floor.
Yep.
Books that didn't make it.
Oh, yeah. And I've got some of those, and I've shared them in the disciple classes that I teach. You know, like there are volumes of the Gospels that didn't make it into the canon, and there are certainly volumes of letters from supposed authors that didn't make it in the canon either. And you know, they're fun to read and fascinating, and some of them offer us historical data points that help as well. But we just don't consider them authoritative like we do the Bible.
Well, that is all we have time today. Thank you everyone for joining us for another episode of Go Beyond. We will see you again on Wednesday at 12:30 as I feel like I am constantly challenging. So today might have felt like challenging questions. So buckle up for Wednesday because I've got some really tough questions coming down that I'm excited to get some answers for. And remember, you can catch all previous episodes or submit your own questions at tmumc.org/go beyond.